The Mafia boss noticed the Black Maid avoiding his eyes, until Rain trapped them in one room alone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Alexander Romano had learned long ago how to read people without asking them a single question, and in the quiet halls of his estate, where marble floors echoed softly beneath measured footsteps, and the air always smelled faintly of polished wood and rain-soaked stone, he noticed what others did not. Naomi Carter never met his eyes. Not once. It wasn't fear in the way she moved, not the stiff panic he saw in new staff or visitors who knew his reputation before they knew his name. It was deliberate, careful, almost disciplined. She entered rooms silently, finished her work with precise efficiency, and exited as if she had never been there at all, her gaze fixed just low enough to be respectful, just far enough away to be unreachable. Alexander watched this from a distance at first, from the top of staircases or across long corridors measured in feet rather than steps. Noticing how her shoulders remained steady even when his presence filled the space, how her hands never trembled when she adjusted a vase or folded linen, how she seemed to draw an invisible line that no one was allowed to cross. He had built an empire on command and compliance, yet something about her restraint unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Naomi Carter, on the other hand, was acutely aware of him in ways she never allowed herself to show. She knew the sound of his footsteps, the subtle change in the atmosphere when he entered a room, the way conversations softened without being told to. She avoided his eyes not because she believed him cruel, but because she understood power and understood that safety often lived in invisibility. Her life had taught her that attention could be a door that only opened one way, and once crossed it, rarely led back. So she worked, she listened, and she looked everywhere except at the man whose name carried weight in rooms she would never sit in. On the afternoon the sky darkened without warning. Rain began to fall hard enough to blur the tall windows lining the west wing, turning the world outside into a wash of gray and silver. Thunder rolled low, distant but insistent, and the estate shifted into a softer rhythm, lights dimming slightly as clouds swallowed the sun. Naomi had been sent to finish a task on the upper floor, a short job meant to take minutes, not knowing how quickly minutes could stretch when weather decided otherwise. Alexander, delayed by a call that ended sooner than expected, found himself walking the same corridor, the sound of rain growing louder with every step, until the storm sealed the house into a kind of shared stillness. In that quiet, when escape routes narrowed and space mattered, the distance Naomi had so carefully maintained would soon be tested, not by force or command, but by circumstance, and Alexander Romano, for the first time, wondered what it truly meant that she refused to meet his gaze. Naomi Carter had learned that distance was not measured in feet but in awareness, and in a house this large, awareness traveled faster than sound. After the storm began, her task slowed not because of fear, but because the rhythm of the estate shifted, each hallway softened by the steady drumming of rain against glass and stone. She moved from room to room with practiced efficiency, counting steps, noting doorways, keeping her focus on surfaces that needed attention rather than the man whose presence altered the air without effort. Alexander Romano remained an unseen weight behind her awareness, not following, not calling her name, simply existing in the same space with a quiet authority that did not need reinforcement. He noticed how she adjusted her path when their routes nearly crossed, how she paused just long enough to allow him passage without acknowledgement, how her posture never bent, yet never challenged. To him, this was new. People usually reacted to him in predictable ways, either shrinking or overcompensating, but Naomi did neither. Her calm was not submission, and it was not indifference. It was choice. Alexander found himself slowing his pace, something he rarely did, observing how she worked with a focus that suggested respect for the task itself rather than the environment it existed in. The rain outside intensified, drops streaking down windows measured in yards rather than inches, and thunder rolled again, closer this time, low and resonant. Somewhere deeper in the house, a door closed softly, followed by the distant hum of the backup system adjusting to the weather. Naomi finished arranging a shelf and reached for her cart, aware that her usual exit route would take her past the west corridor, a longer stretch where sound carried easily. She calculated alternatives quickly, turning instead toward a narrower passage lined with tall windows that framed the storm like a moving painting. Alexander, meanwhile, had stepped away from his office earlier than planned, drawn by the restlessness he could not quite name. He did not intend to intersect with her path, yet timing had a way of making decisions irrelevant. When he reached the corridor, he saw her reflection first, faintly mirrored in the darkened glass, her face composed, eyes focused ahead. She sensed him a second later, not turning, only adjusting her grip on the cart, continuing forward as if unaware. The space between them closed to less than 10 feet, close enough for him to notice the steady pace of her breathing, close enough for her to feel the subtle pressure of his attention without looking. Neither spoke. The estate seemed to hold its breath with them, rain filling the silence with a sound that was constant but never intrusive. Naomi reminded herself that this was temporary, that proximity did not require engagement, that dignity often lived in restraint. Alexander reminded himself that command was unnecessary, that curiosity did not need to be answered aloud. The lights flickered once, briefly, then steadied, casting softer shadows along the walls. In that moment, both understood something unspoken, that the distance they maintained was not about fear or power, but about boundaries carefully built and rarely tested. And as the storm continued to press against the house, those boundaries would soon face a question neither of them had planned to ask. The corridor did not narrow any further, but the sense of enclosure grew as the storm pressed harder against the windows, rain tracing uneven paths down the glass like restless fingers. Alexander Romano became aware of a subtle shift within himself, a rare interruption in the disciplined order of his thoughts. He was accustomed to controlling rooms, to setting tone and direction without raising his voice. Yet here he found himself measuring his presence, adjusting his pace so it did not crowd the woman walking just ahead of him. Naomi Carter felt this too, not as a threat, but as a change in pressure, like the air before a storm breaks. She had learned to recognize when attention sharpened, when silence meant observation rather than absence. Her instincts urged her to maintain the line she had drawn since her first day, the line that allowed her to work, to earn, to exist without being defined by someone else's gaze. She kept her eyes forward, her posture steady, reminding herself that respect was something she carried, not something granted. Alexander watched the way she moved, noting that there was no haste in her steps, no attempt to flee the shared space. This restraint unsettled him more than fear ever had. He wondered, briefly and against habit, what it took to cultivate such composure. What experiences shaped a person who chose distance not out of weakness, but out of intention? The rain grew louder, thunder rolling again, and for a moment the estate seemed smaller, its wide halls reduced to corridors of sound and shadow. Naomi reached the end of the passage and paused, just long enough to adjust the items on her cart, her reflection catching briefly in the darkened glass beside her. Alexander saw her face clearly then, calm, guarded, carrying a weight that did not bend her spine. He realized that she was not avoiding him because she saw him as untouchable, but because she understood the cost of being seen. That realization settled heavily, bringing with it an unfamiliar sense of restraint. He resisted the impulse to speak, recognizing that words would intrude on something carefully balanced. Naomi sensed the pause behind her, the choice not made, and felt a quiet acknowledgement pass between them without a single exchanged glance. She resumed her work, pushing the cart forward as the lights dimmed slightly, the house responding to the storm with a soft hum. Time stretched, measured now not in minutes, but in awareness, each second marked by rain and breath and unspoken thought. Alexander remained still, allowing the moment to pass without command, understanding that control did not always mean intervention. Naomi continued on, aware that something had shifted, not externally, but within the shared silence they left behind. The storm showed no sign of easing, and as the estate adjusted once more to the weather's insistence, both carried forward an understanding neither could yet name, that the distance between them was not empty space, but a deliberate boundary shaped by dignity, restraint, and a mutual recognition that some lines, once noticed, demanded respect rather than crossing. The storm settled into a steady rhythm, rain falling in sheets that blurred the estate's outer grounds into indistinct shapes. And with that rhythm came a subtle shift in the house itself, as if the walls had grown more attentive. Naomi Carter moved through her remaining tasks with the same precision she always carried, but her awareness lingered longer than usual on small details. The way the air felt heavier near the windows, the way distant thunder caused a brief tightening in her shoulders before she consciously released it. She told herself this was only weather, only another afternoon shaped by circumstances beyond control, yet she could not ignore the sense that something unseen had begun to track her movements more carefully. Alexander Romano, meanwhile, returned to his study without fully leaving the corridor behind in his thoughts. He found it difficult to focus on the documents spread across his desk, the measurements and figures blurring together as his attention replayed the image of Naomi standing at the window, composed and unyielding. He realized that what unsettled him was not curiosity alone, but the absence of expectation. She did not seek his approval, nor did she react to his authority in ways he recognized. That absence created space for questions he rarely allowed himself to ask. As the minutes passed, the storm intensified again, lightning illuminating the grounds in brief flashes measured in miles rather than moments, followed by thunder that rolled long enough to vibrate through the floors. The lights flickered once more, dimming noticeably this time, and the house responded with a low mechanical hum as systems adjusted to maintain balance. Naomi paused, listening, calculating whether to continue or wait, choosing patience over haste. She positioned her cart near a doorway that offered shelter without confinement, standing with her hands loosely folded, her posture relaxed but alert. Alexander stepped out of his study at the same moment, drawn by the change in sound and light, and found himself once again in proximity without intention. This time, however, the distance felt altered, not smaller, but more defined. He stopped several feet away, respecting the invisible line she had drawn earlier, and for a brief moment, neither moved. Naomi sensed him there and resisted the urge to turn, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that dignity did not require acknowledgement. Alexander observed her from where he stood, noting the quiet strength in her stillness, the way she held space without claiming it. He became aware that this restraint mirrored something within himself, a discipline forged long before power found him, when survival depended on knowing when not to speak. The storm outside seemed to echo this understanding, relentless yet controlled, powerful without demand. Time slowed, measured now by the space between thunderclaps, each one a reminder of forces that existed without permission. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, preparing to move on once the lights steadied, and Alexander took a single step back, subtle but deliberate, signaling that her path remained clear. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, yet it carried weight precisely because it was unspoken. In that quiet exchange, neither owed the other explanation, but both recognized the moment for what it was, a mutual acknowledgement of boundaries respected rather than tested. As the rain continued to fall, filling the silence with its constant presence, the estate held them in that shared understanding, a pause suspended between roles and expectations, where control yielded to awareness and distance became a form of respect neither had anticipated but both instinctively honored. The weather escalated without warning, rain intensifying until it struck the roof in a steady roar that drowned out distant sounds, and with it came a decisive change inside the estate as the lights dimmed again, this time long enough to alter routines rather than merely interrupt them. Naomi Carter assessed the situation quickly, noting the corridor ahead had grown darker while the nearer service room offered stable lighting and shelter from drafts caused by pressure changes in the building. She guided her cart toward the open doorway, intending to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing, her movements calm and economical. Alexander Romano, alerted by the extended flicker and the low hum of systems compensating, stepped into the same corridor from the opposite end, already aware that the storm had shifted from background presence to controlling force. The rain outside surged, wind pressing against the windows with enough strength to rattle frames measured in inches thick, and the house responded by sealing certain sections to maintain balance. A quiet mechanism engaged, and the corridor doors eased closed behind them with a soft but final sound. Naomi stopped just inside the service room, registering the closure without alarm, understanding that weather dictated patience more often than choice. Alexander halted several feet away, recognizing that the same constraint applied to both of them now, not as a test of authority, but as a practical reality. The room was modest compared to the rest of the estate, designed for function rather than display, with clean counters, storage shelves, and a single window streaked with rain that blurred the grounds into motionless gray. The distance between them remained deliberate, measured at several feet, enough to respect space while acknowledging shared circumstance. Naomi set the cart aside and rested her hands lightly against the counter, grounding herself in the solidity beneath her palms, listening to the rain and the subtle shifts in the building's systems. Alexander remained standing, posture relaxed but attentive, aware that this was the first time the storm had placed them in the same enclosed space, without an immediate exit. Neither spoke. Silence settled, filled by weather and the faint mechanical reassurance of the house adapting to conditions beyond its walls. Naomi kept her gaze lowered, not out of fear, but out of habit formed through understanding, knowing that composure was maintained through consistency. Alexander observed her quietly, noticing how she occupied the room without shrinking or claiming, simply existing with a confidence that did not announce itself. He became aware of the rarity of such moments in his life, spaces where command was unnecessary and presence alone carried meaning. The storm outside showed no sign of easing, rain measured now in relentless volume rather than passing intensity, and the window rattled again, reminding them both that time would be dictated by weather rather than intention. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, settling into stillness rather than restlessness, choosing patience over unease. Alexander mirrored this restraint without conscious effort, stepping no closer, saying nothing that would alter the balance they had maintained throughout the afternoon. In that shared pause, the room became neutral ground, not defined by roles or hierarchy, but by circumstance that demanded mutual awareness. The rain continued to trap them there, not as confinement, but as an invitation to remain present, and within that quiet, both recognized that something subtle had changed, not because distance had vanished, but because it had been preserved with intention, even when the storm left them no choice but to wait together. Time stretched inside the service room, shaped by the steady percussion of rain and the quiet awareness of another presence sharing the space. Naomi Carter focused on the sounds, the way water struck the window in uneven patterns, the low hum of the building maintaining its balance, the faint creak of wood adjusting to changes in pressure. She kept her breathing slow and even, reminding herself that waiting was not weakness, that patience had carried her through moments far less predictable than this. Alexander Romano became conscious of how rarely he allowed himself to simply exist without directive, without shaping outcomes. Standing there, hands relaxed at his sides, he recognized the discipline it took to remain silent, to let the moment unfold without asserting control. He observed how Naomi occupied the room, not shrinking into the corner, not positioning herself in deference, but choosing a place that allowed her to remain composed and ready. The storm outside intensified again, thunder rolling so close it vibrated through the walls, a reminder of forces that answered to no one. Naomi felt the vibration under her feet and steadied herself instinctively, grounding her weight evenly, her expression unchanged. Alexander noticed this subtle response and understood it as experience rather than fear, the kind learned through repetition rather than instruction. The silence between them grew dense, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, filled with thoughts neither voiced. Naomi considered how often she had been told to lower her gaze, to stay unseen, and how she had transformed those instructions into a shield rather than a burden. Avoiding his eyes had never been about submission, but about preserving something she refused to surrender. Alexander, sensing the quiet resolve in her stillness, found himself reconsidering assumptions he rarely questioned. He was used to people reacting to what he represented: power, influence, inevitability, yet Naomi's restraint suggested a different calculus, one where dignity defined boundaries more clearly than authority. The rain continued, relentless, and the window rattled again, droplets racing downward in paths measured in feet rather than inches. Naomi shifted her attention briefly to the counter beside her, tracing its smooth surface with her fingertips, a simple act anchoring her in the present. Alexander took a slow breath, aware that words would fracture the balance they had maintained, that silence here was not absence but choice. He remained where he was, giving space without stepping away, acknowledging proximity without imposing it. Minutes passed, marked by thunder and the rhythmic pulse of rain, and the room seemed to soften around them, its functional simplicity stripping away pretense. Naomi sensed the weight of his attention not as scrutiny, but as recognition, and though she did not look up, she allowed herself a moment of calm acceptance. Alexander felt something settle within him, an understanding that respect could exist without exchange, that presence did not require permission to be felt. The storm showed no immediate sign of breaking, and neither moved to leave, both accepting the pause for what it was. In that quiet, shared without agreement, yet maintained through mutual restraint, they discovered that stillness could speak, that boundaries held with intention could create a space where neither dominance nor retreat defined the moment. Only awareness and the quiet acknowledgement of another human being standing just a few feet away. The rain softened slightly, shifting from a roar to a steady downpour, and with that change came a subtle easing in the room, as if the space itself allowed for breath. Naomi Carter sensed the shift before she acknowledged it, her attention drawn inward by the quiet persistence of the moment. She had remained silent because silence preserved balance, but she also knew that silence, when held too long, could become a wall rather than a boundary. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and for the first time since the storm had closed them into the same space, she allowed her voice to surface, measured and calm. She did not turn toward Alexander Romano when she spoke, did not lift her eyes, choosing instead to let the words exist without demand. She said that she avoided his eyes because attention had a cost, and she had learned to protect what allowed her to keep moving forward. The sentence was simple, offered without explanation or apology, and when it ended, the room returned to quiet. Alexander felt the weight of that truth settle in him more heavily than any accusation could have. He understood immediately that her restraint was not fear, nor was it habit born of obedience, but a deliberate act of self-preservation shaped by experience. He saw, with unexpected clarity, that her dignity did not require recognition to exist, and that by choosing distance, she had been asserting something he rarely encountered. He did not respond right away, allowing the meaning of her words to settle rather than be reshaped by his own voice. The rain continued its steady pattern against the window, droplets tracing paths measured in feet before disappearing from view, and the low hum of the building remained constant, grounding the moment. Naomi felt a quiet release after speaking, not relief, but alignment, as if she had set something down without losing it. She kept her posture composed, trusting that what needed to be understood had been said. Alexander shifted his weight slightly, not moving closer, not stepping away, and in that restraint, Naomi sensed acknowledgement. He understood now why she had drawn her boundaries where she had, and he recognized that crossing them would diminish what he had just been given. His gaze rested on the space between them rather than on her face, a deliberate choice that mirrored the respect she had shown him through avoidance. Time passed, marked by the rhythm of rain and the subtle changes in light as clouds moved overhead. The storm no longer felt like confinement, but like a pause granted by circumstance. Naomi returned her attention to the room, her hands resting lightly at her sides, grounded and present. Alexander remained where he was, absorbing the shift that had occurred, aware that something essential had been revealed without spectacle. In that shared stillness, both understood that the moment did not require elaboration, only recognition, and that the distance they maintained had transformed from separation into understanding, held in place by a mutual respect that neither had expected, but both now carried forward as the rain continued to fall. The quiet that followed her words felt settled rather than fragile, and Alexander Romano responded not with speech, but with action that was almost imperceptible. He took a single step back, increasing the distance between them by a few measured feet, enough to affirm that what she had shared would not be used as leverage or invitation. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and Naomi Carter noticed it immediately, not with surprise, but with recognition. Respect, she understood, often revealed itself through what was withheld rather than what was offered. The rain outside began to ease further, the relentless downpour softening into a steady fall that no longer rattled the window with the same urgency. Light shifted subtly in the room as clouds thinned, and the hum of the building adjusted once more, signaling that systems were returning to their normal rhythm. Naomi released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, feeling the tension ease from her shoulders without loosening her resolve. Alexander turned his attention briefly toward the window, giving her space without removing his presence entirely, a balance that felt intentional rather than dismissive. He recognized that this moment was not about resolution, but about alignment, about acknowledging a boundary and choosing to honor it without commentary. Naomi remained where she was, grounded and composed, aware that the space between them now felt clearer, defined not by uncertainty, but by mutual understanding. The storm had done what storms often did, stripping the environment down to essentials, forcing stillness where movement had been expected. As the rain thinned further, individual drops became distinguishable again, tracing slower paths down the glass, and distant thunder faded into a low echo measured in miles rather than moments. Naomi glanced briefly toward the doorway, sensing that the house would soon reopen its pathways, that waiting would give way to motion. Alexander shifted again, angling his body slightly to ensure her path remained unobstructed, a silent confirmation that she was free to move without negotiation. This gesture, small and unremarkable to anyone else, carried meaning precisely because it was unannounced. Naomi met the moment with equal restraint, not thanking him, not acknowledging the shift with words, but allowing herself a brief, steady look toward the space he occupied, not his eyes, but his presence. It was enough. The lights brightened gradually, returning to their usual clarity, and the sense of enclosure dissolved as the estate resumed its quiet flow. Naomi reached for her cart, her movements smooth and unhurried, and Alexander remained still until she had room to pass without proximity. As she stepped forward, the distance between them held, no longer tense, no longer uncertain. The storm outside continued to fade, leaving behind the clean scent of rain and the muted calm that followed. Neither carried the moment as something fragile or charged, but as something settled, a shared understanding. That required no further attention. When Naomi exited the room and Alexander followed at a respectful interval, both knew that what had shifted would not announce itself in visible ways. It would exist instead in choices made quietly, in boundaries maintained without effort, and in the knowledge that respect, once recognized, did not need to be proven again. The estate returned to its familiar stillness as the rain faded into a light, steady drizzle, the kind that softened the world without demanding attention. Naomi Carter resumed her routine with the same measured calm she carried before the storm, guiding her cart along corridors that now felt wider, clearer, restored to their usual order. Yet something within that order had subtly shifted, not in her duties or pace, but in the quiet confidence with which she moved. She no longer felt the need to calculate every step with the same vigilance, not because the world had become safer, but because a boundary she valued had been seen and left intact. Alexander Romano observed this change from a distance, noticing how the house seemed to accommodate her presence rather than press against it. He found himself returning to his work with a steadier focus, aware that the moment they had shared did not linger as tension, but as clarity. Power, he reflected, often revealed itself through restraint, through the choice to step back rather than forward. The storm had passed, leaving behind clean air and a sense of reset, and with it came the quiet understanding that not every connection required closeness to be meaningful. As afternoon shifted toward evening, light filtered through the windows in warmer tones, casting long reflections across polished floors measured in yards rather than steps. Naomi completed her final tasks and paused briefly near one of those windows, watching the last traces of rain slide away. For the first time since joining the household, she allowed herself to lift her gaze fully, meeting the reflection of the room rather than any single person within it. She felt grounded, not elevated, simply present, carrying her dignity without effort. Alexander passed through the corridor moments later, his steps unhurried, his attention momentarily drawn to the same window. He did not stop, did not speak, but as he moved by, Naomi sensed him and this time did not turn away out of habit. She looked up briefly, meeting his eyes. For a fraction of a second, long enough to acknowledge what had been established and nothing more. There was no challenge in her gaze, no invitation, only quiet certainty. Alexander met that look without surprise, holding it without pressing, then inclined his head almost imperceptibly, a gesture that required no witness. The exchange passed unnoticed by the house itself, absorbed into the rhythm of evening, but for both of them, it marked something complete. The rest of the day unfolded without incident, the estate settling back into its familiar patterns, routines resuming as though uninterrupted. Naomi gathered her things and prepared to leave her shift, confident that the path she walked remained her own. Alexander returned to his study, the window there still open to the fading sound of rain, considering how moments of true balance rarely announce themselves with drama. As night approached, the grounds lay quiet under the softened sky, and the house stood as it always had, unchanged in form, yet subtly altered by a moment of mutual recognition. And in that quiet, unremarkable end to an extraordinary pause, both carried forward a simple truth, that respect earned through restraint left a deeper mark than force ever could, and that sometimes the most lasting shifts occurred not through words spoken, but through the space intentionally preserved between two people who chose to see one another clearly.